In late 1899, a recent Oxford graduate arrives at an asylum to complete his medical training. But as he explores the hospital, he soon realizes that the so-called revolutionary treatments are actually inhumane, and that much more is happening beneath the surface. As always, I invite you to watch this suspenseful movie recap actively till the end to discover its multiple shocking plot twists. During Christmas of 1899, the isolated Stonehearst Asylum welcomed a young visitor. The newcomer introduced himself as Dr. Edward, claiming to have studied medicine at Oxford University.
I'm Edward Newgate. Dr. Edward Newgate from Oxford.
2 weeks prior, Edward had sent a job application letter to the asylum, but unfortunately received no reply, so he came uninvited. The head of the asylum, Director Lamb, warmly received Edward. But Lamb was curious. Why would a top graduate from such a prestigious university travel all the way to this god-forsaken place? After all, Stonehearst Asylum was located deep in the mountains, far from civilization, with poor transportation. Even the families of patients rarely came to visit. Edward explained that working in a mental hospital had been his lifelong dream. In his eyes, mental illness is the cruelest disease in the world. Not only do patients lose their reason, dignity, and soul, but they also slowly die in pain and numbness, often without receiving an ounce of sympathy from others. So Edward hoped to do what little he could to bring kindness and hope to the patients here. His words deeply moved Dr. Lamb, who immediately decided to hire Edward and gave him a tour of the asylum. To Edward's surprise, Lamb had not implemented any coercive treatments. The patients lived freely, and the whole asylum radiated a bizarre yet joyful atmosphere. Lamb explained that traditional punishments and confinement were far too brutal and savage. Meanwhile, sedatives only made patients more dazed and disconnected. So instead, they adopted a natural therapy approach here. Patients could do whatever they wanted. For example, one patient believed he was a horse, so they simply let him continue being a horse. To forcibly shatter his delusion would only turn a happy horse back into a miserable human. Lamb's progressive treatment philosophy earned Edward's full admiration. At that moment, Edward's attention was drawn to a beautiful noblewoman playing the piano. Among the bizarre behavior of the other patients, she appeared graceful, elegant, and completely normal. One would never guess she was a patient herself. Lamb told Edward that her name was Lady Eliza Graves, and she suffered from severe depression. She was extremely averse to physical contact. If someone touched a certain sensitive spot on her body, she would fall into violent convulsions. After her father arranged her marriage to a wealthy baron, Eliza's condition worsened and she began showing violent tendencies. During one episode, she bit off one of the baron's ears and dug out one of his eyes with a comb. After that, her father sent her here. The baron now writes to the asylum every week, threatening them to issue a certificate declaring Eliza mentally recovered, so he can take his fiancée back home. But each time he was firmly rejected by Director Lamb. According to Lamb, not only was the baron violent, he also had perverse fetishes. It was likely that Eliza's worsening condition was caused by the abuse she suffered at his hands. To prevent her from being harmed again, Lamb refused to discharge her. Eliza's tragic situation awakened a strong protective instinct in Dr. Edward. He couldn't take his eyes off her. Eliza noticed Edward's intense gaze, and when their eyes met, there was a mutual sense of affection. As said, Edward's visit happened to fall on Christmas Day. That night, the asylum hosted a lavish dinner. Patients and staff all gathered to eat together, chatting and laughing joyfully, a stark contrast to the cold, grim image of typical asylums. Still, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but as a guest, he chose to go with the flow. During dinner, Lamb's assistant, Mickey Finn, told an extremely vulgar joke, which annoyed the well-mannered Edward and said that Mickey Finn is a funny name. The two exchanged a few heated words until Lamb scolded Finn into silence. As an apology, Finn poured Edward a glass of wine, but just as Edward raised the glass to drink, Eliza, sitting across from him, suddenly kicked him under the table, causing the wine to spill all over his clothes. She quickly offered to help clean the mess and led Edward to a quiet, empty corner. Looking panicked, Eliza scolded him for coming to this place and urged him to leave immediately. As for why, she refused to say more. Though Edward also found the asylum suspicious, he had worked hard to get here and didn't want to leave so easily without understanding what was going on. Seeing that he wouldn't listen, Eliza had no choice but to give up. After dinner, Edward settled into the room Lamb had arranged for him. Just as he was about to sleep, he heard strange knocking sounds coming from the air vents. Following the sound, he found his way to a dark basement, where he discovered a dungeon holding many prisoners. When they realized Edward was the new doctor, they immediately began shouting that they weren't mentally ill, and begged him to let them out. Edward assumed they were dangerous patients and turned to leave in fear. Just then, an older woman suddenly called out his name. She claimed to be the head nurse of the asylum and said she had received Edward's job application few weeks ago. According to her, the people imprisoned here were the real medical staff, while the people Edward had met so far were actually patients posing as doctors and nurses. The so-called Director Lamb was a mentally ill patient suffering from delusions of grandeur. Under his influence, the other patients joined him, and they had secretly drugged the medical staff's wine with sedatives, and while everyone was unconscious, they locked them up. Only then did Edward realize why Eliza had knocked over his wine glass. The wine she spilled must have been drugged as well. After explaining the whole situation, the real doctors begged Edward to steal the keys from Lamb and set them free. But the real hospital director warned that even if they escaped now, they lacked the strength to fight the lunatics outside. Lamb had been feeding them only scraps each day, leaving them too weak to resist. Plus, with the freezing weather and no proper clothing, even if they fled, they wouldn't get far. The real director suggested that Edward instead go to the nearest town and seek help. However, that town was 2 to 3 days away from the asylum. Edward feared something might go wrong in that time. After much thought, he finally decided to take Eliza with him and escape. Back upstairs, Edward knocked on Eliza's door. He told her everything he had learned about the asylum's dark truth and tried to persuade her to leave with him. But Eliza refused his offer. While they were in a standoff, fake Director Lamb and Finn approached them. Lamb politely asked what the two were discussing. Thinking quickly, Eliza lied and said that Edward, being new, had gotten lost in the residential wing and was asking her for directions. Thanks to Eliza's quick thinking, they avoided suspicion, but Lamb's doubts about Edward had already been planted. Edward didn't dare make any rash moves and returned to his room. Later, he managed to find another chance to speak to Eliza alone, again urging her to flee with him, but she rejected him once more. Eliza told Edward that aside from the head nurse, most of the people imprisoned downstairs were no better than monsters. They had used every cruel method imaginable to torture and humiliate the patients, treating them as less than human. The uprising, she said, was born of utter desperation due to mistreatment and harsh conditions. In particular, the former hospital director was a twisted sadist. After discovering Eliza's deep fear of physical contact, he had intentionally disregarded her boundaries over and over, and even presented her as a textbook case at academic conferences. Edward was furious. Knowing this, he insisted even more strongly that he had to take her away and help her escape this hell. But Eliza was confused. After all, they'd only just met. Why would Edward care so much? Understanding her doubt, Edward showed her the scars on his body. He revealed that he had grown up in an orphanage where he had suffered the same kind of abuse. That's why he could deeply empathize with her pain. Moved by Edward's sincerity, Eliza wavered. But in the end, she couldn't bring herself to abandon the fellow patients she had lived with day after day. Besides, Lamb had promised her that he would take good care of the patients and allow them to live freely in the asylum. So Eliza chose to stay, and Edward also refused to leave without her. Instead, he snuck into the kitchen, stole some food, and gave it to the imprisoned medical staff. He comforted them, saying he'd stay a bit longer to earn Lamb's trust and look for a better rescue plan. However, the doctors could no longer stand their captivity. One day, 2 of them ignored all warnings and tried to break the bars and escape. When Finn heard about it, he led a group on horseback to hunt them down. They quickly cornered the escapees at the edge of a cliff. With nowhere left to run, one of the doctors jumped to his death, while the other was brutally hacked to death by Finn. This escape attempt enraged Lamb. To set an example, he dragged Batman's friend into the operating room and performed electroshock therapy on him. The current fried his brain, turning him into a genuine madman, a shell of who he used to be. Fearing Lamb might harm others next, Edward spoke with the head nurse about arranging a quick escape for everyone. It just so happened to be December 31st, and Lamb was planning a New Year's Eve party at midnight, the perfect opportunity to run. But the nurse had an even better idea. She told Edward that Lamb wasn't entirely evil. He had once been a kind, compassionate battlefield doctor, but something had pushed him over the edge into madness. If Edward could find the cause of Lamb's illness, perhaps he could awaken that kind side again. Edward then went to the cell where Lamb had once lived and found a photo on the wall. It showed a young soldier who looked like just a teenager. Edward had a feeling the photo was very important to Lamb, so he put it in his pocket. While Edward was busy searching for clues, Finn had another psychotic episode and strangled a girl to death. That girl happened to be Eliza's best friend in the asylum. Looking at her cold corpse, Eliza was overwhelmed with grief. To cover up the incident, Lamb claimed the girl had died of sudden illness. Seeing the clear strangulation marks on her friend's neck, Eliza was completely disillusioned with Lamb. She finally realized this place was not the ideal home she had hoped for. At this moment, the clock was about to strike midnight to usher in the new year. To celebrate, Lamb asked someone to go to the cellar and fetch some wine. Edward quietly knocked that person out and poured sedatives into the wine bottles. Unfortunately, Finn accidentally discovered this. Edward was quickly captured and tied up in the operating room. Lamb decided to give him electroshock therapy, too. Edward could only plead with Eliza for help. However, Eliza now suspected that Edward was a bad guy sent by the Baron to capture her and take her back. She had just found Edward's dropped pocket watch, and inside, it was an old photo of herself. Edward had no choice but to confess. He did come here because of Eliza, but he wasn't sent by the Baron. He had fallen in love with her long ago. 6 months earlier, Edward had seen Eliza at an academic conference where she was being presented as a special case. At that time, Eliza looked so miserable and helpless. She desperately tried to explain to the attendees that she wasn't insane and begged them to save her, but no one responded. Edward fell in love with Eliza at first sight and traveled a long distance to find her and take her away. Eliza found it hard to believe Edward's words at first and was a bit stunned. Meanwhile, Lamb was already impatiently preparing to begin the procedure. In this moment of crisis, Edward remembered the photo of the soldier he had taken. He lied, saying there was another old photo of Eliza in his pocket, and asked Lamb to retrieve it for her. Surprisingly, Lamb agreed to fulfill this small request. But when he saw the photo clearly, his expression suddenly went blank and he walked away in a daze. Finn, who held authority in the asylum, unexpectedly let Edward go and picked up the electroshock baton to handle things himself. At that moment, Eliza finally snapped out of her daze. She suddenly charged forward, knocking over Finn, dodged the baton, and attacked him. The huge electric shock ignited Finn's body, and he was consumed by flames, meeting his end. Eliza then untied Edward and, at his suggestion, went to the basement to release all the imprisoned medical staff. Meanwhile, Edward found Lamb, who had disappeared earlier. Lamb was repeatedly miming the act of shooting himself. It turned out that during his time as a field medic, Lamb had experienced countless brutal wars. One day, he finally had a mental breakdown. Surrounded by severely wounded soldiers and hearing their agonizing screams, Lamb suddenly pulled out his gun and ended their suffering. The young soldier in the photo was the last one Lamb shot. After killing him, Lamb turned the gun on himself, only to discover the bullets were all used up. He survived, but lost his mind and was sent to this psychiatric hospital. Later, Lamb deliberately buried those painful memories deep in his mind. But seeing the photo of the young soldier again triggered his memories and plunged him back into a state of mental torment where he desperately wanted to die but couldn't. When Edward found Lamb, he gently told him that the war was over. With Edward's kind reassurance, Lamb finally emerged from his hallucinations and gradually calmed down. After that chaotic night, the sun rose slowly, marking the beginning of a new year. Time passed quickly, and 3 weeks went by. By then, under the leadership of the head nurse, the asylum had become orderly and well managed. Just when things seemed to have quieted down, 2 unexpected guests showed up at the asylum. One of them is none other than the abusive husband that Eliza had previously poked in the eye, and the other is an old man with a white beard who looked like he came straight out of a Sherlock Holmes cosplay convention. The husband politely informed the head nurse that he was there to take his fiancée, Eliza, back home. The nurse replied just as politely, saying that Eliza had already left with Dr. Edward. At that moment, the white-bearded old man suddenly spoke up in shock, claiming that he was the real doctor, Edward. Turns out the young man we've been following this whole time, the one who bravely snuck into the asylum to save Eliza, wasn't a doctor at all. He was a patient, a full-blown pathological liar. 6 months ago, he had also been a special case at medical demonstration at Oxford, just like Eliza. The moment he saw her, it was love at first sight, or obsession at first diagnosis. So what did our charming lunatic do? He escaped from his asylum in London, stole the real Edward's personal belongings, and used his identity to sneak into this new asylum to rescue the woman of his dreams. And right now, he's living happily ever after in another mental institution in Italy under a brand new identity, Dr. Lamb. He's pretending to be the very doctor who was supposed to be treating him. And next to him, the elegant and beautiful Eliza, completely cured of her depression. The two dance happily and embrace in the garden of the new asylum, run peacefully by nuns. Apparently, love really is the best medicine. Or maybe insanity just found its perfect match. Today's movie recap comes from the suspense horror film Stonehearst Asylum, inspired by a short story written by the master of macabre himself, Edgar Allan Poe. It's a chilling tale about a very special group of people that reminded me of a terrifying case from real life. In Italy, there was once a psychiatric hospital that, due to sheer negligence, accidentally admitted 3 completely sane individuals. 2 of them did everything they could to prove they were mentally sound. They pleaded, explained, and reasoned. But the more they tried to convince the staff, the more the doctors believed they were in denial, diagnosing them as classic cases of delusional behavior. The third man, however, took a different approach. He didn't argue or explain. Instead, he simply lived like a normal person, eating, sleeping, reading books and newspapers, and politely saying thank you during his daily shaves. On the 28th day, he was declared miraculously cured and released. Then he went straight to the police and got his 2 poor buddies out of there. And that, my friends, is the irony of the madhouse. Sometimes the sanest thing you can do is stop trying to prove you're sane.